And this week, I'm welcoming back Professor Karen Charlton from the University of Wollongong because the topic we're going to talk about is planetary health and the planetary diet. And there's no one better well equipped to talk about this because I'm going to read you some of Karen's key achievements. So, she's a committee member of the Dietitians Australia Special Interest Group on Food and the Environment. She was a founding member of Nutrition Society of Australia's Special Interest Group on Sustainable Diets and Food Systems that spans food, nutrition, and diet. But the other really key thing is that Karen's a public health nutritionist and she's actually working on an Australian Research Council future fellowship to develop sustainable, healthy, and equitable food systems in the Illawarra and Shoalhaven region of New South Wales. So, welcome back, Karen.
Thanks, Claire, for having me.
When I saw that the Lancet Commission, which for our listeners is, a very fancy international journal, had released an updated report on planetary diets for health, equity, sustainability, I thought, wow, that there's just so much in that. So I
Mm.
wanted to ask you just up front, does what we eat matter? Can what we eat help save the planet?
Well, Claire, the short answer to that massive report is yes, it can seriously help. If we think of food systems drive roughly about a third of global greenhouse emissions. A third. That's a
Yeah,
lot.
that's a lot, isn't it? But
Mm.
I think most people would probably say, how come, what I choose to eat for lunch or not actually affect like the planetary health and
Mm.
the greenhouse emissions? And I think a lot of people would say, and what are they again?
Yeah, so we tend to talk a lot about greenhouse emissions. We tend to talk a lot about climate change and just think climate change is greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, all of that. However, um, climate change is much more than that. It's about biodiversity loss. It's about water use and overuse. It's about pollution. So if we think of the entire food system from production to processing to transport to retail to the consumer eating it and preparing it, well, preparing the food and then eating it, and waste. If you think of each of those subsections, there are many, many impacts on various aspects of these planetary boundaries, we call them. So we'll try and unpack some of that in the next 30 minutes. But what you eat is not going to solve climate change on its own, but it makes the rest of the job much more doable. So we can't just ignore food systems, which up until 2019 was largely kind of ignored.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of makes sense. What I think's hard for individual people though, isn't it, is that when we, choose to eat something or not eat it and like waste it, you tend to only think of yourself and that meal
Mm,
rather
mm,
than the repercussions then for the whole of the environment.
mm,
So, how did this planetary healthy diet then come about? And it's certainly been in the news. I've heard it
mm.
mentioned many times. So, what is the planetary health diet then?
Yes, so back in 2019, that's when the first Eat Lancet Commission came out with its first planetary health diet. And that first report has been cited over 12,000 times. So it's the
Wow.
biggest thing to hit nutrition, I think, since the discovery of vitamins, perhaps.
Wow.
It was massive, and it was quite a shock to a lot of nutritionists because it was very plant rich, almost to the point of vegetarian, although it was promoted as flexitarian. But it was really plenty of vegetables, fruit, whole grains, legumes, nuts. So plant-based foods predominantly on your plate, and then a very modest amount of dairy, poultry, and fish, and a tiny amount of red meat, as well as ultra-processed and sugary foods. So if you can think of a usual sort of plate of an Australian meal, it's very, very different to what most people would recognize. So
Yeah.
this came about in 2019. It has undergone a fair amount of criticism because it was all about individual dietary change, that to save the planet, you should be eating this flexitarian approach, and didn't really think about equity. It didn't really think about those countries that perhaps populations don't have enough of animal-sourced foods. They may be at risk of iron deficiency, protein deficiency, B12, iodine, all of those nutrients that are found predominantly in animal-based foods. So on the 3rd of October 2025, just a couple of weeks ago, this planetary health diet was updated, and this time they had a huge number of over 70 scientists from around 35 different countries who have all come together, each with their own expertise. They're not all nutritionists by any stretch of the imagination. And again, convened by the Eat Lancet Commission. And this time, the planetary health diet is not that dissimilar to the original one in terms of how it looks and
Right.
proportion of energy from different food groups. However, the difference with this one is that it's more about how to achieve. So a much more food systems based approach, a much more equity and fair lens.
Yeah. So does that mean, Karen, when we hear about the planetary health diet now, we it really is targeting actions at like the growers of food, governments, the agricultural sector, or is there still something that each of us individually are supposed to be doing or can be doing to play our
Mm,
part in trying to reduce
mm.
greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, it's a combination of both of those things. There's a very big recognition in the report that without government and policy levers, food systems change is difficult to occur, which then makes it difficult for the individual, even the well-informed and well-intentioned individual, to obtain the kinds of foods that have been grown fairly and that have been grown in a more sustainable fashion.
So what would be a couple of examples what kind of policy can help a country, because of those legislative changes,
Mm.
make our food more environmentally friendly and less impactful on the climate?
Yeah, well, that's been the big sort of question, but I think now it's quite clear. Um, Let me point out, first of all, that we need to feed 10 billion people by 2030, I think it is, or
Yeah,
maybe it's,
that's
yeah.
yeah, that's a
So,
really
so
massive world job, isn't it?
essentially, we have to feed many more people, but with less resources, if you like. Um, but we can, and this has been shown in the report. So this report actually has set out 8 particular action areas. And if you just allow me time to go through the 8,
Okay.
I'll maybe try and kind of give some policy levers that might be appropriate to the Australian context. Um, so the first thing I need to say is that it's about balance. It's about supporting healthier people, but also supporting farmers. We're not getting rid of farmers by any stretch of the
Yeah,
imagination.
well, they grow and produce the food first up, don't they?
Exactly. And it's not about guilt and it's not about going vegan overnight. So let's just get that out of the way. But let's go through the 8 action items. The first one is make healthy and sustainable diets the default. So make the right choice, the easy choice, I guess. So if you could go to the supermarket and choose a food that's healthy, but you also know that that's been grown in the most sustainable way, that's good for the planet and also good for us. For example, if you are going to choose red meat, the report says try and choose meat that's been um, you know, produced by regenerative means and regenerative farming practices. It's not really practical at this point because then, of course, there's going to be a cost factor.
Yeah, well, one of the things then that surely that's gonna have to influence the food labels, isn't it?
Yeah.
And maybe it also means you've gotta have for sale in some smaller portions because it's just the portions you
Mm,
buy, like, if you ended up wasting it, well, then you're not really helping anyone. And actually, that was one thing that I noticed, like in the UK, that in their supermarkets, you can actually
mm,
buy incredibly tiny pieces
mm.
of meat in the supermarket there,
Because it's so
whereas
expensive.
yeah, and I guess, again, because it's so expensive, and that is one
Mm,
of the things that makes you eat less meat, isn't it? When the price and let's face it, it is expensive, whether you're talking about, fish or red meat.
mm. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, the recommendation for, I'm just having a look for beef, pork, or lamb, because pork is also included as red meat, strangely, but
Yeah,
it is only 15 grams a day. So if you think over a week, that would be
like 100 grams a week.
100 grams maximum a week. And 100 grams is a I suppose it's like the size
About
of
the
your palm.
palm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you think most of us that eat meat don't eat that kind of portion size, and that's just once a week. So making healthy and sustainable diets the default. So a policy factor might be labeling, making health star rating mandatory, but then also having additional labeling that, perhaps where that meat has, I'm talking predominantly about meat, but how that that food has been grown, maybe the source, the farmer, that kind of thing. But I think we're still quite a long way away from that.
Yeah, but Karen, like for listeners, that's immediately one easy thing that you can
Mm,
do if you
mm,
want to save the planet. Have
mm,
red meat less often per
mm,
week. And then, looking at how you can make a small amount look like it's a lot more. Because
mm.
I was thinking, well, if you actually put it in a stir fry or something,
Yeah.
then you don't tend to notice that it's a little bit. I think the challenge is
Mm,
when meat is the focus,
mm,
then people notice the size of it, for example. And, maybe it also says that work needs to be done around our expectations of how much meat is actually served because, like you said
mm.
earlier, a lot of people would eat way more than 100
That's right.
grams
In one sitting.
in one
Uh,
sitting.
yeah, my parents were from the northeast of England, and a meal was not considered a proper meal unless it was meat, three veg, and potatoes. And that's how it was for many, many years. But
Well,
so it's just
yeah.
changing our perception of what a meal is, I
Yeah.
guess.
Okay. So what's the next
All
one?
right, so that's number one. Number two is producing food within planetary boundaries, and we can talk a little bit more about planetary boundaries. I said about regenerative grazing, maybe looking at the way that farmers use fertilizers. So there are a number of innovative methods already going on in Australia. It's just to maybe bring those to the fore, and perhaps governments need to be supporting farmers to be farming in a more kind of planet-friendly way.
So how does that relate to a boundary? So farming in a planet-friendly way, meaning you're not producing unwanted byproducts because of the farming, and that affects
Yeah.
the boundary part?
So it's using less phosphorus and nitrogen as
Right.
fertilizers, perhaps using a more circular approach, um, perhaps looking at what you're growing and not monocropping, for example. So you don't just have a farm that grows wheat, but you have lots of different types of crops and animals all on the same
A
farm.
and am I right? Because if you rotate the crops, then you get more, like,
Hmm.
nitrogen goes back into the soil and you don't just, like,
Exactly.
bleed the soil dry, so to speak. And is the circular thing, is that the waste from this resource for this sort of type of farming growing that might be useful in a different growing something else? Is that what you mean
Exactly.
by circular?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly right. So Bega, which is
Cheese,
a
everyone knows that.
yeah, Bega cheese, a region down the south coast. They are the first valley in the country and probably in the world to
Yes.
be aspiring to be a circular economy. So there's a lot of work going on down there, and of course dairy cows are
Yeah.
ruminant animals and they produce a lot of methane. So they've got a lot of work to do, but they are doing quite or they're investigating ways that that circular approach can be much more aligned. And it's not just about chemicals and it's not just about fertilizers, but it's also about reusing packaging, sharing of resources. But let's get back to the eight,
Okay. Yep. What's next?
because we don't want to get stuck. So that's producing food within planetary boundaries. Food waste and food loss. We need to halve all of our food waste and food loss. We throw out at least 7 million tons of food a year, which is enough to fill the MCG 9 times over. It's a huge, huge, huge amount of food. So we need to halve food waste. And there are some strategies for food waste in Australia. I'm trying to find the one that it's called Australia's National Food Waste Strategy, and that aims to halve food waste by 2030. A lot of food relief agencies are helping to reduce food waste, but also I think most of the food waste in our country comes from household food waste. So buying
Wow.
too much, throwing away things that are past their sell-by date. Also, a lot of municipalities now are using FOGO, food organics, garden organics, which means that you put all of your food waste into your green bin, and then
Yep.
that gets recycled into fertilizer. So that's a great initiative
Yeah,
of
our
many,
council
many
does that
councils.
does
Mm,
that here, Karen. So they
yeah, that's
create
great.
all their own fertilizer from our household
Mm,
green waste.
mm, excellent. But of course, people have to use the little caddy, and some people don't like it. Um, so, number 4 is promoting social justice and workers' rights. This is not such a big issue in Australia. We have quite good workers' rights, but in many, many countries, agricultural farm workers are the least paid um,
Right.
of all kind of jobs.
Well, I think we can all understand the importance of that, and we are lucky to live here, aren't we? So
Yeah.
what's the
The
next on your list?
So align finance, markets, and policies. So this is kind of outside of my remit, um, but we do need to understand how government is supporting health, is supporting agriculture, and Australian markets are very much export focused at the moment on food. A lot of our food, and probably around about 60 to 70% of the food we produce is exported.
Oh,
So
wow.
maybe not having such a focus on export, but how can we make sure that our population in Australia has access to sufficient food? Because food insecurity is a big problem still
Yeah, and
in
it is
Australia
increasing in
and
Australia, isn't it?
increasing. Yes, but I mean the good thing is that we now have um, we are going to have a food security strategy, and that policy is being developed at the moment by the federal government. So there is a recognition that food insecurity is a problem that needs to be addressed here in
Yeah.
Australia.
Yeah, I think all of us in Australia would agree that that's something that's really important is to make sure that everyone has the right
A
to
right to food.
enough food and enough healthy food. So
Exactly.
what was next on the
Okay,
list?
so number 6 is strengthen governance and transparency. So we do have in Australia a food waste roadmap. We do have a really great document that came from CSIRO last year called Reshaping Australian Food Systems. And that's a roadmap how we can actually produce food in a better way. So we have a lot of documents, we have a lot of knowledge, we have a lot
Yeah.
of innovation. It's just to make this mainstream. So number 7 is respecting and protecting traditional diets and culture. That's really important for our Indigenous cultures in Australia, understanding food ways, understanding seasonal growing, understand what grows in your local area, and perhaps be consuming more of that. So tapping into the ancient wisdom that we have on our continent. And then the last one is enhancing innovation and technology. And this is an area that CSIRO has invested a lot of money in. There are things such as vertical farms grow in Brisbane. There's alternative protein startups in Melbourne. There's all sorts of things going on. There's a lot of innovation. But the thing is to get that innovation into mainstream that can provide food that people actually want to eat as well.
I think we do see a lot of innovation at the supermarkets,
Mm,
and I think the whole push for even talking about foods as being plant-based really
mm,
did kick off around that 2019 with the first Eat Lancet.
mm,
And I know at my local supermarket, you go there, there's a whole plant-based section. I find it interesting because some of the things were there already, like
mm,
tofu, for example, but they are expanding the options. But sometimes I think it's good to remind people about the plant-based foods that were already there, like vegetables, fruit, all the canned and dried legumes, good
mm,
old baked
mm.
beans, always like to give it a shout out, but all the
Exactly.
variety of beans. And they're really, really cheap as
They're
well.
very, very cheap and very economical. But we do need to teach people how to incorporate such
Yeah,
foods into diets. A lot of people have not really been exposed to them.
yeah,
Um, but I do have a little bit of a bugbear with the protein, with the plant-based processed foods because
yeah,
sometimes they're still processed. So if you're going
yeah.
to get a veggie burger that's been processed and packaged in plastic and so on, it may not necessarily be any better than having a
Yeah.
beef burger. So, again, if you can avoid processed foods, then that's a good
Yeah,
sort of mantra to go by.
and when it comes to the teaching people how to cook, that's certainly what we try to do, show to people how to blend the plant-based foods in with traditional foods they
Yeah,
might be more
exactly.
accustomed to. So,
Exactly.
in terms of these 8 recommendations then, are you hopeful that we'll get some progress on that, and especially here in Australia? And I mean, I guess that's what your fellowship's doing.
Yeah, I'm hopeful, but we need to rejig the whole system, and that's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah,
We have a lot of competing interests. I live in a what used to be a steel city, as you do, Wollongong, and there's a big major focus on green energy solutions. It's all about energy, 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 energy. However, and our slogan for our city is the city of innovation. I think we could be the city of food innovation because we can grow food for our local population. We can process food here. People are amenable to more of a local food system. So I do think we need to be thinking more locally. But again, you've got to think of supply chains. These things don't happen overnight. But I think if there's enough pushback from the consumers, the people actually buying the food. I think, anything's possible, but we just need the political will. So, the Eat Lancet is a great report for trying to get policy levers in place. And what I might point out that it is very rights focused. So it's a rights-based approach. And there are
yeah,
three rights that the whole report is based on. First of all, the right to food, the human right to food, and that's, as you said before, healthy and sustainable food. The right to a healthy environment. We don't live in particularly healthy environments. In some countries, that's pollution, but here it may be, being able to exercise outside. It may be a healthy environment, as in, not having too many fast food outlets and having more sort of fresh food shops in your environment.
yeah.
And then the last one is the right to decent work, because without the right to decent, fair paid work, people are not going to be able to access sufficient foods. So if we're thinking about a rights-based approach, a just food system, it kind of fits into place.
Yeah, and
All
when
of
you
the
think about it
recommendations.
on the global level, again, it just sort of reminds me of how lucky we are living in
Mm,
Australia. I know
mm,
some of our capital cities, there's days where you're not allowed to exercise outside, but imagine for in some countries in the world, that's like the everyday norm where the pollution is so bad that
that's
people,
right.
it's very hard for people to do that. How can people, if they're super interested in this whole, Eat Lancet and the
Mm.
planetary health diet, where do you go to get more information to find out more about it?
Oh, there's been a heap load of information on the internet. I mean, if you just Google Eat Lancet 2.0, you'll come up with all sorts of
Great.
websites. There will be recipes coming out. There's been some videos. I mean, it's everywhere. But I think, sometimes people think I have to do everything. I have to do everything right now. You don't have to do everything. You can just, as you said, maybe, have more beans in your meat-based dishes, or maybe say one day a week we're going to have a vegetarian type day. So you can do little changes, and if everybody does little things, that adds up over the longer term. You can say, okay, let's do a food waste audit in our house this week. Let's actually, and I have friends that have done this, let's measure all of our food waste and see how many kilos we are throwing away, and let's try and work out how much money we could save by,
Yeah.
not buying too much and by planning a little bit better.
I have
So,
one thing, Karen, that I think that people can do on a Thursday, because you tend to do your grocery shopping at the end of the week. And I
mm,
think usually towards the end of the week, that's when people are more likely to get, home delivery or something. But there's
mm,
usually a meal in your fridge already.
yeah,
Opening your veggie crisper and just stir frying the lot of it. One of our team, Elise, who's on a lot of the podcasts, she turns all of that into like a bolognese sauce and then puts it in the freezer for the nights
great
where
idea.
yeah, where she doesn't feel like cooking. So I think if you can commit to one day of
Mm,
the week where you go,
mm.
what's lurking in the fridge? There usually is some sort of scrap leftover meal that can end up tasting amazing and you've already got it right
That's
there.
right.
And then another example is, And this was started in the UK by the Paul McCartney Foundation, and as many people know, he was a big encourager of people to become
Mm.
vegetarian. But they have Meat Free Monday,
Yeah,
and
meat-free
and
Monday.
on No Money No Time, we've got lots of recipes that are
Mm,
vegetarian. You just got to click that filter, or even just
mm,
using less meat.
that's
You
right.
can be doing your bit to try and save the planet.
Mm. So, I mean, I don't want to leave the podcast with people thinking I have to be vegetarian. You don't have to be vegetarian.
That's
I mean,
right.
still having some chicken, some poultry, fish, shellfish, eggs. So those are still included in the planetary health diet. It's just the amounts. And if people are really interested, they can go and look for recipes. But I found that a very simple way of thinking about it, and this is what the planetary health diet recommend. It's not what I'm recommending as a dietitian, but they say 1 serve of dairy, and I can hear um, the Australian Dietary Guidelines Committee going, no, that's not enough, and possibly it's not, but they say 1 + 1 + 1. 1 serve of dairy a day, 1 serve of animal-based products, and they've got specific amounts, egg, chicken, fish, and red meat once a week, 1 + 1 + 1.
Yeah.
There are some critiques, I've got to say. Ty Beale from Gain and some other people do say that the planetary health diet may not be sufficient in micronutrients, but that's probably another podcast
Karen,
altogether.
yeah. I think if you look at the way most Australians eat,
Mm,
there's close to one third of what we eat actually comes from those more processed and packaged foods.
mm,
So I think the other opportunity is to look at
mm,
what it's encouraging more of. Like it's encouraging more
yeah,
vegetables, more fruit, more
mm,
grains, and diversity of whole grains, nuts,
nuts.
legumes. So there's a lot of positives that make
Yes,
for really interesting eating as well. So, can
that's
I
right.
ask you in closing, is there anything else that you think people need to know about the planetary diet and sustainable eating in general?
Um, I think the challenges are quite large, let me say. I think Australia is a country that is already trying to do things in a better way. Um, and I think personally, I think a lot of people are trying to do the best thing. If I can just end with a couple of statistics, this planetary health diet has been estimated to save up to 15 million premature deaths per year. This is globe
15
million.
million if we
That's
all ate like the
yeah,
planetary health
yeah. So
diet.
that's
Wow.
globally, of course.
Yeah.
So that's about 40,000 deaths, premature deaths could be prevented each year. And that's mostly from preventing non-communicable diseases or chronic diseases.
So that's
Um,
heart disease and diabetes. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And if we all ate like that and we halved food waste and, farming systems changed, then 50% of the impact on greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced. Well,
Yeah.
50% from the food system. So, the solutions are there. I don't think any country necessarily ascribes or complies totally with the
Yeah.
planetary health diet. The Mediterranean diets, populations that consume a Mediterranean diet are perhaps the closest to the planetary health diet. But I mean, if there was one takeaway, I would say try and reduce discretionary foods. So all of those extra foods that we don't need, that don't provide much in terms of nutrients, but they do require energy to produce them. They do have a lot of waste and so on.
Yeah, and they come in little packets, which often got a lot of
Exactly.
plastic too,
Yeah,
don't they?
exactly.
Yeah. So, Karen, you've given us some more recipes, which look wonderful, and we're definitely going to put them on No Money, No Time. Can you just tell me a little bit about what made you pick these recipes?
Well, I've got to admit, I didn't pick these ones. My daughter is a fourth-year dietetics student at the University of Wollongong. Her name's Ella, Ella Scott, and she'll probably be very angry at me for saying this, but she's a great, great cook, and she follows a plant-based diet herself. And she's actually got a blog and everything, essentially Ella Nutrition. So I reached out to her and I said, "Oh, Ella, do you have any recipes that would be aligned with Eat Lancet too?" And she sent a couple to me. I think one's a pumpkin and
Yeah, that one looks
risotto.
especially great. Pumpkin and lentil dal and
Yes.
Mediterranean chickpea and roasted vegetable grain bowl. So they're both going straight to the website, and we're going to add
Yeah.
Ella's name on them, and we'll put a link in the show notes as well. So thank her on our behalf.
I will too.
Okay. So thanks for chatting to us again today, Karen. And I like what you said, like, don't feel overwhelmed. People
Mm.
shouldn't feel overwhelmed, but just do what they can. And all of those small changes, then you know you're doing your bit to help save the planet.
Yeah, and vote for food. Next time you're thinking about who you're going to vote for in your local government, state government, federal government, have a look and see if they have anything in their portfolio around food. So vote for food.
Okay. Sounds great. We'll do that.
All right. Thank you,
Thank
Claire.
you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye bye.